Power doesn't announce itself. It waits until someone else admits it exists. At some point, something strange happened. You weren't trying to intimidate anyone. You weren't plotting, performing, or playing mind games. You were just living, thinking clearly and moving differently. And yet, someone eventually said it out loud, maybe half joking, maybe half nervous, that you're a psychological warfare master. That statement didn't come from fear of what you do. It came from discomfort with what you no longer do. Here's the quiet fact most people don't realize. Studies in behavioral psychology consistently show that people feel the highest level of threat not from aggression, but from unpredictability paired with emotional control. The human brain relaxes around chaos it understands. It panics around calm it cannot explain. That's why shouting feels familiar, but composure feels suspicious. You didn't raise your voice, you raised your level of internal order, and that shook the room. What really unsettled them wasn't your intelligence or your confidence. It was the moment they realized you stopped giving them access. No emotional entry point, no predictable reactions, no explanation they could twist later. You didn't shut them out dramatically. You simply closed the door quietly and kept living your life. That's when confusion set in. Confusion always comes before respect or resentment. There's also a slightly funny part to this, whether people admit it or not. The same individuals who used to underestimate you are now busy narrating your every move like amateur analysts in a low-budget documentary. You became strategic the moment you stopped being convenient. Funny how that works. This isn't about manipulation or control. It's about what happens when someone masters their inner world so well that it accidentally disrupts everyone else's. When self-discipline looks like strategy, when boundaries look like tactics, when peace of mind gets mistaken for a calculated plan. So if you've ever watched someone slowly realize they can't read you anymore, and then nervously label you something dramatic to make sense of it, this isn't coincidence. This is the unspoken psychology behind why self-mastery gets mistaken for warfare, and why your presence alone started forcing admissions nobody planned to make. Number one, you stopped reacting emotionally, and that dismantled their leverage. At first, nobody noticed it. That's the funny part. You didn't announce a change, didn't give a speech, didn't suddenly become cold or distant. You simply stopped feeding situations with emotion. And for people who were used to pulling reactions out of you, frustration, explanations, anger, over-justifying, that was like trying to start a fire with wet matches. Nothing caught. Most people don't realize how much of everyday power depends on emotional access. When someone can trigger you, they can steer you. They don't need authority, logic, or even truth. They just need a button. Once you stopped reacting, that button stopped working. And when a familiar tactic fails, it doesn't just confuse people, it exposes them. What made it unsettling wasn't your silence or calm on its own. It was the sudden imbalance. They were still operating emotionally while you weren't. Conversations that used to escalate now fell flat. Provocations that once sparked debates now landed nowhere. You weren't passive. You were unavailable to manipulation. That distinction matters. Here's the part people rarely admit. Emotional reactions reassure others that they still matter in your internal world. When you react, you're saying, you have influence here. When you don't, you're not insulting them. You're removing proof of relevance. That hits deeper than anger ever could. They began to feel naked. Their sarcasm sounded louder than intended. Their pressure felt obvious. Without your emotional response to mask it, their behavior stood alone, exposed and awkward. And the moment someone sees themselves clearly without the cover of your reactions, discomfort follows fast. You didn't become detached from life. You became selective with your energy. You chose response over reaction. You paused. You thought. You let things pass without chasing closure or control. That kind of restraint looks simple, but it's rare. It signals internal stability, and stability quietly outranks volatility in every psychological hierarchy. That's why the label appeared. Psychological warfare wasn't about strategy, it was projection. When their usual leverage disappeared, they needed an explanation that preserved their ego. Calling you calculated felt better than admitting they'd lost emotional access. In reality, you didn't overpower anyone. You outgrew the need to be pulled. And once emotional hooks stop working, the entire game changes, without you ever touching the board. Number 2, you made your inner life inaccessible, and it unsettled them. There was a time when people could read you easily, not because they were especially smart, but because you made yourself available. You explained your thoughts, shared your worries, clarified your intentions, and filled in the gaps before anyone even asked. It felt normal, even polite. But access slowly turned into entitlement, and before you knew it, people felt comfortable walking through your mental space without knocking. Then something changed. You stopped giving guided tours of your inner world, not out of bitterness or secrecy, but out of self-respect. You realized not everyone needs to know what you're thinking, planning, or feeling. Your answers became simpler, your explanations shorter. Your emotional life stopped being a public service. That shift did more than create boundaries. It disrupted expectations. People are deeply uncomfortable when they can't locate themselves in your mind. They want to know where they stand, not out of care, but out of control. When you stopped offering that reassurance, they felt unsteady. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt incomplete to them, even though nothing was actually missing. What unsettled them most was the absence of clues, no emotional breadcrumbs, no oversharing they could reinterpret later, no mental access they could use to predict your moves. You weren't hiding, you were containing, and containment signals maturity, even if people don't have the language for it. Without access to your inner life, they had to sit with their own assumptions. That's when discomfort grew. People project when they lack information. They fill silence with stories, motives, and narratives that say more about them than you. Suddenly, you were hard to read, different, or strategic, not because you changed who you are, but because you stopped explaining yourself to be liked. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Emotional transparency is often confused with honesty, but they're not the same thing. You can be honest without being exposed. When you learned that difference, your presence shifted. You became grounded, centered, and less available to influence. That's why they felt unsettled. Access creates familiarity, and familiarity creates comfort. When access disappears, people lose their footing. Your inner life became private territory, and privacy, to someone used to entry, feels like resistance. You didn't build walls, you built depth, and depth makes people realize how shallow their reach really was. Number 3, you learned their patterns faster than they realized. Humans are creatures of habit, and most people move through life thinking their routines, reactions, and strategies are invisible. They believe they are unpredictable, clever, or untouchable. The truth is, patterns reveal themselves quickly if you know where to look, and once you see them, you can predict more than they intend to show. That's exactly what happened. You weren't trying to be clever. You were simply paying attention, noticing repetitions, timing, and triggers. And while they assumed they were studying you, the roles had quietly reversed. They didn't notice at first. A pause here, a repeated phrase there, a small tell in their tone, tiny signals that everyone else ignores. But you were observing, memorizing, and internalizing. You began to anticipate their moves before they even made them, and that anticipation changed your behavior subtly. Conversations flowed differently because you weren't reacting in the old ways. You weren't reacting at all, at least not in the predictable ways they expected. And that is disorienting for anyone who thrives on manipulating responses. What made it even more unsettling was that this wasn't obvious. You weren't pointing out their weaknesses or calling them out. You simply behaved as if their moves didn't affect you, even when you had already figured them out. There is a quiet terror in realizing someone sees the invisible threads you thought were hidden. They start to second-guess themselves, overthink every gesture, and feel their control slipping without understanding why. The real power here is subtle. Learning patterns isn't about winning a confrontation. It's about knowing the terrain before they even realize it exists. Once you've mapped their tendencies, you can navigate interactions effortlessly, making it appear as though you are untouchable or omniscient. And to someone used to being in control, that reads like strategy, genius, or even intimidation, when in reality it's just observation applied consistently. You didn't need theatrics, you didn't need to announce it, you simply understood them better than they understood themselves, and that alone reshaped the entire dynamic. Once patterns are seen and held silently, the game changes, and the players don't even know the rules have been rewritten. Number 4, you stopped arguing facts and started exposing motives. Most people think winning a conversation is about proving who's right or who knows more. They assume logic and facts are weapons, and so they line up arguments like soldiers. But you discovered something far more powerful. People are terrified of having their motives exposed. Facts can be debated, numbers can be twisted, and stories can be reinterpreted. Motives, however, reveal intent, and intent is uncomfortable because it touches the part of ourselves we rarely admit exists. You didn't confront them head-on with accusations. You didn't point fingers or deliver a verdict. Instead, you responded to the why behind their actions. You noticed the subtle shifts, how their words were designed to provoke, how their compliments came with hidden critiques, how their stories were more about saving face than sharing truth. By addressing the underlying reason, you bypassed surface arguments entirely. Facts became irrelevant because their own intentions were staring them in the face, reflected back with precision they couldn't ignore. This is where most people get unsettled. They are used to controlling the narrative through visible means, debating points, proving expertise, or creating confusion. When someone targets motives instead, it's like holding a mirror to their hidden strategy. Suddenly, their manipulations are obvious not to outsiders, but to themselves. And that is far more destabilizing than losing a debate, because losing a debate is temporary, but confronting your own hidden motives is existential. You didn't need drama to do this. You didn't need to raise your voice or deliver monologues. By remaining composed and focused on intention rather than surface facts, you forced them into a position of self-recognition. They realized that everything they thought was hidden was visible, and there was no clever way to defend it. What's remarkable is that this approach doesn't just shift power in the moment, it rewires perception. People start treating you differently because your attention feels surgical. You are no longer debating facts, you are illuminating truth. And truth, when aimed at motives, hits harder than any argument ever could. Once that realization occurs, respect, caution, or even fear quietly follows without you ever having to demand it. Number 5, you removed predictability from your behavior. Most people rely on patterns, habits, and expectations to feel safe in their interactions. They don't consciously notice it, but predictability is their invisible comfort blanket. When someone responds the way they expect, it reinforces control. When someone doesn't, it creates subtle panic, doubt, and unease. That's exactly what happened when you stopped being predictable. You didn't act randomly for show. You acted deliberately, but on your own terms, without being guided by others' expectations. and the effect was immediate. Conversations became less like a game they could play and more like walking through a room where the furniture has shifted. They weren't sure where to lean, what to say, or how to respond. Every tactic they relied on, provoking anger, triggering guilt, applying pressure, stopped landing the way it used to. They were used to reading you like an open book. Suddenly the book was closed, and the pages were being rewritten in ways only you knew. That unpredictability didn't just confuse them. It undermined the sense of power they had assumed over you. The beauty of removing predictability isn't chaos. It's subtle control through self-mastery. You weren't acting erratically, you were acting freely, without obligations to satisfy expectations. They might have tried to force patterns onto you, interpreting every gesture, every word, every pause, but none of it fit the script they had memorized. And that's profoundly disorienting for someone who thrives on forecasting behavior. What's remarkable is how quickly this changes dynamics. They begin second-guessing themselves. They replay past interactions, trying to figure out what triggered the shift. They even start overanalyzing things you haven't done yet. Their mental energy, which used to be directed at influencing you, is now consumed with understanding you and failing. You didn't need to confront anyone or prove a point. You simply chose to live and respond in ways that honored your own timing, priorities, and boundaries. Predictability may comfort the manipulator, but when you remove it, you reclaim psychological space. In doing so, you shift the balance subtly but completely, and they realize too late that the person they thought they could predict has become untouchable, not because of force, but because of autonomy. Number 6, you didn't confront directly. You allowed self-exposure. Most people believe confrontation is the way to assert power. They think calling someone out, pointing fingers, or proving them wrong is the only way to gain control. You didn't play that game. You stopped reacting with direct challenges and instead let situations unfold while maintaining your composure. You didn't need to attack or accuse because you understood a deeper truth. People reveal more about themselves when they feel in charge, and nothing exposes them faster than giving them the illusion of control. By stepping back and refusing to engage in the expected way, you created a subtle but overwhelming psychological pressure. You didn't need to say anything dramatic. Silence and restraint were enough. People started talking more, explaining themselves, justifying behaviors, and revealing intentions they would have otherwise hidden. And the remarkable part is that you didn't have to do a thing to provoke this. They did it themselves. This works because humans are wired to confirm their own narratives. When they think they are shaping the situation, they unconsciously over-explain, overshare, and stumble into self-exposure. They display inconsistencies, reveal insecurities, and highlight motives without realizing they're doing it. What would normally be hidden behind defensiveness now appeared in plain sight, and they had no idea they were showing you exactly what they wanted to keep secret. The power of this technique lies in its subtlety. You're not manipulating in an obvious way. You're simply observing, listening, and letting the other person's own behavior do the work for you. They believe they are leading, but in reality, they are walking right into the clarity you've quietly maintained. This flips the dynamic entirely. Instead of them evaluating you, you are now evaluating them, seeing their patterns, motives, and weaknesses as if they're standing still under a spotlight. You didn't need confrontation because confrontation demands energy and exposes you in return. By stepping aside, you forced self-exposure. They didn't just lose leverage, they unknowingly gave it away. And when they finally notice, it's too late. The realization that they've been revealing everything while thinking they controlled the interaction hits harder than any argument ever could. You didn't break them, they broke themselves with your presence as the silent catalyst. Number 7. You mastered restraint, not dominance. Most people confuse power with aggression, thinking that to be in control, you have to push, prove, or dominate. You didn't follow that script. You discovered a quieter, far more unsettling form of influence: restraint. By controlling yourself, by holding back impulses, words, and reactions, you created a presence that is impossible to manipulate. People are used to responding to force, but restraint is invisible until it hits them. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand attention. Yet it commands more authority than any overt act of dominance ever could. Restraint works because it flips the expected dynamic. When someone is aggressive, manipulative, or trying to provoke, they assume you will react in kind. They rely on your predictable emotional responses to validate their control. But when you choose not to react, when you pause, observe, and let things unfold without interference, you take away their leverage without confrontation. That's the subtle brilliance of restraint. It doesn't challenge them directly. It forces them to confront themselves. Their tactics lose power not because you overpowered them, but because you refuse to participate in the pattern they depend on. The impact of restraint is both immediate and long-lasting. It communicates self-discipline, stability, and independence in a way that aggression cannot. People sense it instinctively, even if they can't articulate why they feel unsettled. They notice that you are not controlled by impulse, not swayed by ego, and not dependent on approval. That calm, contained energy disrupts their assumptions about how influence works. Restraint also creates a psychological space where others reveal themselves. When you don't react, when you don't push back, people often overcompensate. They over-explain, over-justify, and in doing so expose motives, fears, and patterns that were hidden before. You become a silent mirror, and what they see is far more revealing than anything you could have forced out of them. Mastering restraint is not about winning arguments or asserting dominance. It's about owning yourself fully. And when you do that, the world around you begins to shift, not because you attacked, but because you refused to be moved. True psychological power lies in this quiet mastery, and it's far more disruptive than aggression ever is. Number 8, you refuse to compete for validation. Most people live their lives seeking approval without even realizing it. They shape their words, actions, and even thoughts around what others will accept, admire, or approve. That constant chase creates invisible chains, and anyone who notices them can pull, prod, and manipulate at will. You stopped playing that game. You refused to compete for validation, and in doing so, you instantly changed the rules of interaction. Suddenly, you were no longer participating in someone else's hierarchy. You were operating on your own terms. Refusing validation isn't about arrogance or being unfeeling. It's about understanding that your sense of worth comes from inside, not from applause or acknowledgement. When you stop seeking approval, your behavior stops feeding the expectations of others. People who thrived on your need to be liked, understood, or recognized suddenly find themselves powerless. Their influence depends on your participation, and when you remove that, the structure they relied on collapses quietly, almost invisibly. The subtle power in this is often underestimated. People notice it immediately, even if they can't put it into words. They may start trying harder, being louder or more persuasive, but the truth is, you're no longer a target. They're just talking to themselves. That creates an odd mix of confusion and respect. They realize that your choices, your reactions, and your presence are no longer theirs to shape. Their old leverage doesn't work, and their assumptions about your behavior fall apart. What's fascinating is how liberating this feels internally. When you stop competing for validation, you also stop wasting energy on unnecessary battles. Conversations, interactions, and conflicts lose the exhausting tension of trying to win approval. Instead, you operate from clarity and self-possession, which is far more intimidating than argument or force. People eventually notice. They start labeling you strategic, unshakable, psychologically sharp. But what they're really seeing is a person who has mastered self-recognition. You didn't have to prove anything to anyone. By refusing validation, you revealed a quiet dominance that can't be claimed or challenged. It's the kind of power that doesn't announce itself, yet leaves a permanent impression on everyone who thought they could control it. Number 9. You stayed calm where emotional reactions were expected. Most people rely on emotional reactions to measure power. Anger, frustration, panic. These are the signals others expect, the predictable pulses that allow them to gauge influence and control. You didn't give them that. In moments where they expected fireworks, outbursts, or defensiveness, you remained calm, composed, almost unshakable. That calm wasn't emptiness or passivity. It was an active, deliberate state of control. And that simple shift unsettled everything around you. Staying calm in high-pressure or provocative situations does more than signal self-control. It dismantles their assumptions. People are used to chaos and reactivity because that's the environment they operate in themselves. When someone refuses to meet them on that level, it throws off their internal map. They start overthinking their approach, second-guessing their strategy, and questioning whether they actually understand the dynamics at all. That uncertainty, invisible to the casual observer, is a form of quiet dominance. What makes this powerful is how it redirects attention. Instead of focusing on you or trying to manipulate you, they focus on themselves. They notice their own impatience, overreactions, and illogical impulses. Your calm acts like a mirror, reflecting the chaos they expected to provoke back onto them. It forces self-awareness, discomfort, and often hesitation. They may never admit it, but they recognize that your stability is a kind of force they cannot penetrate. Calmness also communicates confidence without words. It says that you are grounded, that your decisions are considered, and that your presence is independent of their influence. While they scramble to provoke or destabilize, you operate from a place of clarity and certainty. The subtlety here is genius. No one can argue with composure. No one can attack serenity directly without revealing their own instability. By staying calm where reactions were expected, you shifted the power quietly but completely. The momentary restraint becomes long-term influence. People start treating you differently, not because you demanded it, but because your composure makes them realize their usual tools no longer work. That kind of presence isn't taught, it's mastered, and once it's recognized, it leaves a lasting imprint on everyone who encounters it. Number 10. You allowed discomfort to exist without fixing it. Most people can't stand discomfort. They rush to fill silence, smooth tension, or provide answers, even when none are needed. That constant need to fix situations is a form of dependence. You, however, stopped doing that. You allowed discomfort to exist without interference. You didn't apologize for it, explain it away, or try to make others feel better. You simply let it be. And that simple act shifted the entire dynamic. Allowing discomfort doesn't mean cruelty. It means presence. It means observing without panicking, letting reality settle, and refusing to step into someone else's nervousness or insecurity. When people are uncomfortable, they crave resolution. When you deny them that shortcut, they are forced to confront themselves instead of escaping into distraction. Their unease grows, but it's not directed at you. It's directed inward, where it hurts the most. The power in this comes from restraint and observation. Most attempts to control others rely on action, words, or influence. You demonstrated that true influence often comes from inaction. By refusing to solve every tension, you revealed who was dependent, who was reactive, and who relied on external cues to feel secure. They start revealing themselves without realizing it, because their need for resolution pushes them to fill the gap you left intentionally. Discomfort also creates clarity. In a world full of noise, explanations, and distractions, letting things simply exist forces people to see the situation as it really is. No spin, no interpretation, no emotional filters. That clarity is uncomfortable because it forces responsibility and self-awareness, two things most people avoid. By allowing discomfort to exist, you became untouchable in subtle ways. You weren't aggressive, manipulative, or controlling. You were simply grounded, composed, and willing to witness reality without interference. That kind of presence is rare and unsettling for anyone used to controlling outcomes through agitation or persuasion. You didn't create chaos, you revealed it. And in doing so, you made everyone else confront their own patterns while you remained steady, calm, and impossible to sway. Number 11. You didn't mirror their aggression or insecurity. Most people instinctively respond to tension the way it's presented to them. If someone raises their voice, they raise theirs. If someone attacks, they attack back. If someone is insecure, they try to reassure, argue, or compete. That reflex creates predictable patterns that manipulators rely on. You broke that pattern. You refused to mirror their aggression or feed their insecurity, and that refusal changed everything without a single word. By not mirroring, you removed the usual feedback loop. They expected reactions, anger, defensiveness, anxiety, but instead found calm, neutrality, and sometimes even silence. That absence of confirmation is deeply destabilizing. Aggression thrives on reflection. Insecurity thrives on attention. When you denied both, the usual tools they used to manipulate, provoke, or dominate stopped working. Suddenly, their emotional energy had nowhere to land, and they had to confront it internally, often uncomfortably. The subtle genius here is that mirroring is one of the most natural human tendencies. We match moods, postures, and energy to connect or control. By refusing to do so, you created a psychological void that couldn't be ignored. Your presence became a measuring stick, not a participant in the usual emotional games. They realized, often too late, that their attempts to unsettle or influence you were ineffective. This doesn't mean you were unresponsive. You were responsive on your own terms, choosing clarity over reaction. That distinction is critical. Aggression or insecurity is loud, chaotic, and exhausting. By not joining it, you made it obvious and almost absurd. The same words, the same tones, the same pressures suddenly appeared small, desperate, or irrational because you refused to validate them through your reaction. What people eventually notice is that your behavior feels unshakable, even untouchable. You didn't overpower them. You denied them the confirmation their emotional strategies depended on. In doing so, you became quietly dominant, not through force, but through self-control and discernment. And that kind of mastery is rare. It unsettles, impresses, and above all, shifts the power dynamic without you ever having to assert it. Number 12, you made them question their own influence. Most people operate under the quiet assumption that they have some measure of control over those around them. It doesn't matter if it's through charm, manipulation, or authority. They rely on it to feel secure. You didn't confront them directly, but you dismantled that assumption entirely. Through your calm, measured, and unpredictable presence, you made them wonder if their usual influence over people, even over you, actually existed at all. That doubt is far more destabilizing than any argument or conflict because it attacks the foundation of how they see themselves. When someone realizes their tactics aren't working, they scramble. They replay interactions, dissect their own words, and second-guess every move they thought was clever. You didn't have to challenge them. You simply existed outside the framework they depend on. Your behavior didn't confirm, react, or validate. That refusal to participate in their usual dynamic forced them to face an uncomfortable truth. Their control was never as strong as they believed. This kind of disruption works quietly but powerfully. Influence is a currency, and when you stop spending it on the person trying to control you, they feel bankrupt. They notice subtle things first: the lack of reaction, the refusal to justify, the calm in moments designed to provoke. Over time, these small moments accumulate into a realization that the levers they thought existed are missing. That's when doubt creeps in, and doubt is corrosive because it breeds hesitation, overthinking, and insecurity. What makes it even more profound is that you didn't need force or manipulation to achieve it. You didn't need to assert superiority or dominate the conversation. By simply controlling yourself and refusing to participate in the usual power games, you created a psychological vacuum. They were left staring into it, trying to reconcile why they felt powerless in a situation where they expected to succeed. The irony is that influence is only real when it is recognized by the other person. By making them question theirs, you revealed the true source of power: self-mastery. Once that realization hits, everything changes. They may try harder, react differently, or even mask their unease. But underneath, they know that the game they thought they were winning is no longer theirs to play. Number 13, you operated from self-containment, not performance. Most people measure influence by how loudly they can be seen or how convincingly they can perform. They believe control comes from gestures, words, and actions meant to impress, intimidate, or persuade. You didn't play that game. You operated from self-containment. Your sense of power and stability came from within, not from the reactions you provoked in others. That difference is subtle but seismic. People can imitate performance, but self-containment is unmistakable, and it cannot be faked. Self-containment shows itself in quiet ways: a steady tone of voice when everyone else is flustered, an unshaken posture when tension rises, a focus on clarity when confusion swirls around you. You didn't need to assert dominance because your inner equilibrium communicated authority on its own. People noticed that you were present, fully grounded, and not dependent on approval, applause, or the validation of others. That made them uneasy in ways that performance never could. They realized that no clever trick, emotional push, or subtle manipulation would get a predictable result from you anymore. What makes self-containment so powerful is that it exposes the superficiality of others. People who rely on performance, whether charm, aggression, or dramatics, look desperate when faced with someone whose energy is self-contained. Your presence becomes a mirror, showing them how much of their influence depends on external reactions, and that reflection is rarely comfortable. They see their patterns, their insecurities, and their dependence on others' responses, all without you saying a word. Another layer of power lies in permanence. Performance fades. It requires constant upkeep and attention. Self-containment doesn't. Once you've anchored yourself internally, no external chaos can shake you. You no longer need to prove, manipulate, or perform. You simply exist, and that existence carries weight because it doesn't bend to anyone else's narrative. By operating from self-containment, you shifted the dynamic completely. Influence now emanates from your presence, not your actions. People notice it instinctively, even if they can't articulate why. That kind of power doesn't demand recognition. It commands it quietly, and once it's felt, it leaves an indelible impression. Number 14. You didn't try to control them. You controlled yourself. Most people confuse influence with manipulation. They think power comes from steering others, controlling outcomes, or bending situations to their will. You didn't fall into that trap. You understood that the real game isn't about others, it's about mastery over yourself. By controlling your thoughts, reactions, and emotions, you created an invisible authority that no one could touch, predict, or challenge. That's what makes it terrifying and fascinating to people who thought they could manipulate you. Controlling yourself doesn't mean suppressing feelings or pretending to be calm. It means being fully aware of your impulses and choosing when and how to act. It means knowing your priorities, understanding your triggers, and refusing to let someone else dictate your internal state. That quiet mastery transforms interactions. Suddenly, you are no longer participating in the chaos others rely on to feel dominant. They throw their usual tactics at you: provocation, guilt, manipulation, even charm, and nothing lands because you are operating from an unshakable center. The effect is subtle but undeniable. People around you begin to feel exposed. They sense that their attempts to push, provoke, or influence are useless. Their usual levers of control vanish because you are not reacting predictably. They are left to confront their own intentions, insecurities, and patterns without the usual validation that comes from seeing a response. That reflection is unnerving. They may laugh it off, rationalize it, or even try harder. But the truth is, you've removed their power without needing to claim any. Self-control also communicates strength in ways words cannot. It signals discipline, awareness, and independence. People instinctively respect it, even if they can't explain why. It creates the rare combination of calm authority and invisibly felt dominance that doesn't require demonstration. You didn't need to prove anything, perform any strategy, or fight any battle. By simply mastering yourself, you change the rules of engagement. In the end, this is the ultimate psychological advantage. Those around you may think you're a master of strategy or manipulation, but the truth is simpler and far more powerful. You didn't need to control them because you controlled the only thing that truly matters: you. And once that control exists, everything else falls into perspective, leaving others to realize that influence is not granted, it is earned through self-mastery. Conclusion. The truth is simple, yet few ever truly grasp it. Real psychological power doesn't come from forcing others, winning arguments, or controlling situations. It comes from mastering yourself. Every subtle shift, the calm when chaos was expected, the restraint when others demanded reaction, the refusal to compete for validation, the quiet observation of patterns, wasn't about manipulation. It was about self-possession. By controlling your thoughts, reactions, and inner world, you created a presence so grounded that others could no longer predict, provoke, or influence you. They weren't defeated by force. They were confronted by clarity, consistency, and self-containment. What emerges from all of this is a profound understanding of human behavior. People are shaped by expectations, emotional triggers, and their assumptions about others. When you remove yourself from those predictable dynamics, you disrupt their sense of control. They reveal themselves, question their influence, and stumble over motives they can no longer hide. And while they panic internally, your power quietly grows. It isn't flashy, it isn't loud, and it doesn't demand recognition, but it leaves a lasting imprint. Being a psychological force is not about what you say or do. It's about what you allow to happen around you without losing your balance. It's about observing, containing, and responding on your own terms. It's about showing that true mastery is silent, measured, and unwavering. That is the difference between temporary influence and lasting authority, the kind that others recognize instinctively, even if they cannot fully articulate it. If you want to internalize this level of presence, start with yourself. Control your reactions, value your inner life, and refuse to feed the patterns others rely on. The results are subtle but undeniable, and the transformation is permanent. If this gave you clarity, insight, or a new perspective, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, comment your thoughts below, and share it with someone who needs to see it. This is the kind of understanding that changes the way you move through the world, and it's just getting started. Stay blessed always, and Happy New Year.